I had been driving for hours, with nothing but the sound of the engine and the hum of the tires to keep me company. As the sun began to set, I realized that I needed to find a place to stop for the night. Luckily, I spotted a truck stop up ahead and decided to pull in. As I parked my truck, I couldn't help but notice that something felt off. The other truckers around me were all staring blankly ahead, with glazed eyes and slow movements. It was as if they were all in some kind of trance. I shook my head, trying to dispel the eerie feeling that was settling over me. I made my way into the truck stop and ordered some food, hoping that a hot meal would help me forget about the strange behavior of the other truckers. But as I sat at a booth, eating my burger, I couldn't help but notice that the other truckers were still acting strange. They moved as if they were sleepwalking, their eyes unfocused and their movements sluggish. It was then that I heard a whisper, a voice that seemed to be coming from inside my own head. "Leave this place," the voice said. "You're in danger here." I looked around, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from, but there was no one nearby. The other truckers continued to shuffle around, seemingly oblivious to everything. I finished my meal quickly and got up to leave, feeling an urgent need to get away from this strange place. But as I made my way back to my truck, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder and faster, until they seemed to be right behind me. I broke into a run, feeling a sense of terror wash over me. As I reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as possible. But before I could get inside, I felt a cold hand close around my ankle, pulling me back. I turned around, ready to fight, but what I saw made me freeze in terror. The other truckers had all gathered around me, their eyes now filled with a malevolent glow. It was as if they were possessed by some kind of demonic force. I tried to struggle free, but their grip was too strong. I could feel their fingers digging into my flesh as they dragged me towards the back of the truck stop. As we entered a dark alleyway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the shadows, I could make out the form of a monstrous creature with eyes that glowed like hot coals and teeth as sharp as knives. I knew then that I was in the presence of pure evil. The other truckers pushed me forward towards the creature as it let out a deafening roar. As I hit the ground, I scrambled to my feet and turned to face the creature. It was now fully in view, its long, spindly legs and arms stretching out in all directions, and its eyes fixed on me. I knew I had to run and find a place to hide. I bolted towards the truck stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, its breath hot on my neck. As I reached the door, I turned the handle and slammed it shut behind me, hoping to keep the creature out. But the creature was too strong. It bashed against the door, sending shivers down my spine. I knew I had to find another way out. I looked around and spotted a door leading to the basement. I pushed it open and ran down the stairs, hoping to find a place to hide. As I descended into the darkness, I could hear the creature following me, its footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. I tried to move as quietly as I could, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the creature found me. I stumbled upon a storage room and rushed inside, closing the door behind me. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I tried to catch my breath and calm myself down, but the sound of the creature's footsteps outside made it impossible. Suddenly, I heard a scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. I looked over and saw a small hole in the wall, barely big enough for me to crawl through. Without thinking, I squeezed myself through the hole and found myself in a narrow tunnel. The tunnel was dark and musty, and I had to crawl on my hands and knees to move forward. I had no idea where it led, but I knew I had to keep moving. I could hear the creature's footsteps growing louder, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found me. As I crawled through the tunnel, I suddenly felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around and saw the creature looming over me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I screamed and tried to crawl faster, but it grabbed my ankle and pulled me back. I kicked and thrashed, trying to break free, but it was no use. The creature was too strong. It dragged me back into the storage room and lifted me up, holding me in its spindly arms. As it lifted me closer to its face, I could see its eyes gleaming with hunger. I knew I was about to become its next meal. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the worst. But then, suddenly, I felt a gust of wind and a flash of light. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone, and I was alone in the storage room. I stumbled to my feet and looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And that's when I saw it. A small amulet lying on the ground, shimmering in the dim light. I picked it up and felt a surge of power coursing through my veins. I knew then that I had been given a second chance, and that I had a responsibility to use this newfound power to protect myself and others from the horrors that lurked in the darkness. Let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. As a long-haul truck driver, I've seen a lot of strange things on the road. But what I experienced last week still sends shivers down my spine. I was running behind schedule and decided to take a shortcut through an abandoned town to make up some time. The town looked like it had been left to rot for decades, with boarded-up buildings and broken windows. But as I drove through the town, I noticed something odd. Despite the appearance of abandonment, there were people watching me. Not just any people, but locals, who all looked like they had just stepped out of a different era. They were all dressed in 50s-style clothing and stared at me with intense, piercing gazes. Feeling uneasy, I stopped at a gas station to ask for directions. The man behind the counter had a wild-eyed look and spoke in a slow, drawling voice. He told me that the town had been cursed and that no one who entered ever left. I chuckled at the absurdity of it all and went on my way, convinced that the man was just trying to scare me. But as I drove deeper into the town, things started to get stranger. The road twisted and turned in impossible ways, and the air became thick with an eerie silence. Suddenly, I came across a group of people in the middle of the road. They were all dressed in black robes, their faces hidden by masks. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for me. I tried to back up and turn around, but my truck wouldn't budge. The engine died, and I was trapped. The masked figures started to approach me, and I was paralyzed with fear. What I learned later was that the town was cursed by a group of Satanists back in the 50s, and that the locals were all under their control. But I did not know this when I decided to ask for help when my truck died. I hesitated for a moment before taking a step forward. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I made my way through the quiet and eerie streets. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the crumbling pavement. The buildings that lined the street were old and decrepit, some of them missing walls or roofs, and I could see signs of neglect and decay everywhere I looked. As I walked, I began to feel like I was being watched. I turned around several times, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement, but saw nothing. The sense of unease continued to grow, and I quickened my pace, feeling a growing urgency to get out of this place. Suddenly, I heard a noise that made me freeze in my tracks. It was the sound of footsteps, coming from behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I started running, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way down the darkened street. I could hear the footsteps behind me, growing louder and closer, and I knew that I was not alone in this abandoned town. As I ran, I noticed a faint light in the distance. It was coming from a building at the end of the street, and I could see shadows moving behind the windows. It was the first sign of life I had seen since I arrived in this town, and I knew that I had to investigate. I approached the building cautiously, my hand hovering over the door handle. I pushed the door open slowly, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a nauseating odor that filled my nostrils, and I could feel bile rising in my throat. The room was dimly lit, with a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, each one stacked high with jars and bottles filled with murky liquids. There were strange instruments scattered throughout the room, and a large metal table sat in the center. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed that there were people here. They were standing in the shadows, watching me with cold, dead eyes. Their skin was pale and translucent, and I could see the veins running just beneath the surface. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and I knew in that moment that they were not alive. I turned to run, but it was too late. They were upon me, grabbing me from all sides and dragging me towards the metal table. I struggled against them, but they were too strong. As I lay there, helpless, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I ever could have imagined. This town was not abandoned at all, but rather a front for a cult that had been operating in secret for decades. I was trapped there, a prisoner of the cult, forced to participate in their twisted rituals and experiments for weeks. One night, when they had tied me up in front of a fire for their monthly ritual, a group of trucks drove past the line over the cult's leader and destroyed the altar. Panic had set in. I have no idea what was happening, but I passed out at that moment. It so happened that my colleagues had finally traced me and were there for my rescue. I woke up on a hospital bed, miles away from the cursed town where I was interrogated about my disappearance. I still can't explain what happened that night, but I know that I'll never forget it. The memory of those masked figures and the cult leader's twisted smile will haunt me forever. It was supposed to be a routine haul through a remote wilderness area, but as the miles stretched on, I knew something wasn't right. I had this feeling of being watched, of being hunted, and it only intensified as the sun began to set and darkness descended on the road ahead. The headlights of my truck illuminated only a small patch of the road ahead, casting eerie shadows in the surrounding trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that crept up my spine, but it only seemed to grow stronger with each passing mile. As I drove, I began to hear strange noises outside the truck, the sound of branches snapping and rustling underfoot. I told myself it was just an animal, nothing to worry about, but the noises seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a shadowy figure moving at the edge of my vision. But then, it stepped into the light of my headlights, and I saw it for what it truly was. A creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its skin was gray and mottled, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It stood tall on two legs, but its arms hung down past its knees, ending in long, sharp claws. I slammed on the brakes, but the creature was already upon me. It reached through the window, its claws tearing at the glass as I desperately tried to start the engine and pull away. But my truck would just not start. The creature pulled me out of my truck and threw me against a tree in that darkness. Without a thought, I stood up and started running for cover. It was a struggle for survival, one that seemed to last for hours. The creature was relentless, stalking me through the wilderness, always just a step behind. I saw a huge tree ahead of me and started climbing it. I clung to the branches tightly as I could, trying to regulate my breathing so that I didn't give away my position. Below me, I could hear the creature snuffling and growling, searching for me in the darkness. I could see it clearly now. It was about the size of a grizzly bear, but with a long, narrow snout and teeth like knives. Its fur was matted and mangy, and its eyes glowed with a sickly green light that made my blood run cold. For what seemed like hours, I stayed up in the tree, too scared to move or even make a sound. But the creature was persistent. It circled the tree again and again, searching for any sign of me. As the night wore on, my fear turned to exhaustion. I was cold and hungry, and my muscles ached from clinging to the branch. But I knew that if I made a wrong move, the creature would have me in an instant. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard a distant sound, the roar of an engine, growing louder by the second. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the darkness, and finally caught sight of the headlights of a pickup truck as it barreled down the road. The creature, distracted by the noise, turned its attention away from me for just a moment, and that was all the opening I needed. With a burst of adrenaline, I leaped down from the tree and sprinted towards the road, hoping against hope that the truck would see me. It was like something out of a nightmare, the creature hot on my heels, my legs burning with fatigue, and the truck just ahead, growing closer and closer with every step. I could hear the driver shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the pounding of my heart. But then, in a moment of sheer luck, I stumbled and fell right into the path of the oncoming truck. I braced myself for impact, but at the last second, the driver swerved to avoid me, slamming on the brakes and coming to a screeching halt just a few feet away. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling towards the truck as the creature closed in behind me. But the driver was quick. He leaned out of the window and snatched me up by the arm, pulling me into the cab and slamming the door shut behind me. For a few seconds, we sat there in stunned silence, panting and shaking with adrenaline. And then the driver spoke, his voice shaking with disbelief. "What the hell was that thing?" he said. I didn't know how to answer. All I could do was stare out the window, watching as the creature disappeared into the darkness behind us. And I knew that, even though I had escaped with my life, I would never be the same again. I'm a truck driver and I've been on the road for almost 20 years. I've seen a lot of strange things during my time behind the wheel, but nothing quite like what I experienced last night. I was driving through the back roads of Virginia, trying to make my delivery on time. It was late at night and the road was dark and winding. The trees towered over me, casting long shadows across the pavement. As I drove, I started to feel like I was lost. I had been on this road before, but it didn't look familiar. The GPS on my phone wasn't working and I had no idea where I was. That's when I saw him. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. He was wearing a dark cloak and had his face covered by a hood. I slammed on my brakes and honked my horn, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, beckoning me towards him. I got out of my truck, trying to get a better look at the figure. But as I approached him, he started to move away. I followed him, not sure why, but feeling like I had no choice. We walked for what felt like hours, through the dark and winding roads. The figure never spoke, he just led me on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn towards something dangerous. Finally, we came to a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing was a small cabin, surrounded by a fence made of human bones. The figure led me through the gate and into the cabin. Inside, I saw something that I will never forget. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and there were jars filled with strange substances lining the shelves. In the center of the room was a figure covered in a black robe, surrounded by candles. The figure looked up at me, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. It was as if I had stumbled upon a cult, practicing some sort of dark ritual. Suddenly, the figure started to move towards me. I tried to run, but the figure was too fast. He grabbed me by the arm and dragged me towards the center of the room. I was surrounded by darkness and I felt like I was going to die. But just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The figure released me and disappeared into the shadows. I stumbled out of the cabin, shaking and confused. I ran back to my truck and drove away as fast as I could. I've never been so scared in my life. I don't know what that figure was or what he wanted, but I do know that I'll never forget the night I got lost on those dark and winding roads. I've always been cautious when it comes to picking up hitchhikers. But on that night, I was tired and eager to get to my destination. The desolate stretch of road seemed to go on forever, with nothing but darkness surrounding me. And then, I saw her. She was a young woman, standing alone on the side of the road, her thumb outstretched. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" She didn't say a word. She just got into the cab, her eyes fixed on me in the rearview mirror. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. As we drove, I tried to make small talk with her, but she remained silent. I started to feel uneasy, as if I had picked up more than just a hitchhiker. Suddenly, she spoke. "Stop the truck." I pulled over to the side of the road, and she got out. I watched her disappear into the darkness, and as I pulled back onto the road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then, I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, her long hair whipping around her face in the wind. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I hit her. I got out of the truck, shaking with fear and guilt. But when I looked down, there was no one there. Just the empty road, stretching out into the darkness. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Strange things started happening in my truck, things that couldn't be explained by mechanical malfunctions. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the temperature in the cab would drop suddenly and drastically. And then, one night, I saw her again. She was standing outside my truck, her eyes filled with rage. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. And then, I felt something cold wrap around my neck. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted with anger and pain. They found my truck a few days later, abandoned on the side of the road. They never found my body, but I know where it is. I'm still in that truck, trapped by the hitchhiker's vengeful spirit, doomed to haunt the highways forever.